I am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 271, T855 Great Ursa Planet. The longevity plant, although a creation of the Swarm, was presented as a wild species, seemingly unconnected to the Swarm. For a faction like the Reckon that had been operating on Great Dawn Planet for years, the large-scale conflict with Godzilla wouldn't have escaped the Swarm's notice. Once the Swarm identified such activity, it would have been illogical not to exploit the opportunity. Overplaying their hand would seem too deliberate, undermining the Swarm's intelligence and insulting any potential observers. Thus, it was only reasonable that the Swarm had introduced fungal carpet seeds into the longevity plants. There were flaws, of course, like the current Godzilla being a product of the Swarm, raising questions about whether any observers had witnessed the wild version of Godzilla being killed by the Swarm. As a biological civilization, the Swarm could justify replicating a Godzilla. The reason could even be framed as precautionary, ensuring the Reckon didn't suspect anomalies. But why reveal it? Why was there longevity plant evidence in the nest? Luo Wen had no solution for these inconsistencies. He could only hope that during that period, the Swarm was not worthy of attention. After all, at the time, his perspective and vigilance weren't high enough to anticipate these issues. As for whether the Swarm's actions would be detected by potential observers, Luo Wen thought it was possible, if they existed. But who could say for sure? Sometimes exposing a little while concealing the rest might even bait hidden enemies into action. After all, the unseen threat was always the more terrifying. Through the intelligent entities embedded within the Reckon, especially with Lieutenant Colonel Cross in a senior position, the Swarm had complete insight into the Reckon's movements and decisions. The Special Operations Team had made multiple trips to Godzilla's nest, harvesting large quantities of longevity plants. With an abundance of experimental material, Dr. Balt's research had made significant progress. Perhaps in a few more years, he might even develop a side effect-free longevity serum. However, the Swarm's groundwork was complete, its strategic objectives achieved. Luo Wen was eager to proceed with the next phase of his plan. Overlord, calculations show that Great Ursa Planet will be at its closest to Great Dawn Planet in 11 days. Excellent. The Reckon have been here long enough. It's time to send them home. General, our scout ship near T855 has been attacked, a crew member reported abruptly. What's the situation? General Masai demanded in shock. Our drones and satellites have lost contact. This is the last set of data they transmitted. On the screen before General Masai, several images and textual reports were displayed. They were nearly identical, the systems detected targeting, and then, without locating any attacker, the feed abruptly cut out. Have you deduced their method of attack? With the aid of artificial intelligence, the crew rapidly analyzed the data. After a few minutes, one responded, General, when slowing down one of the videos by 20,000 times, we discovered a projectile. Based on the energy level and speed of the attack, the enemy most likely used electromagnetic railguns. A completely different technological paradigm, General Masai mused. The enemy had developed a path starkly different from the Reckon's energy-based weaponry, opting instead to master physical systems. Back when the Reckon fleet established their base near T853, Great Dawn Planet's orbit, they had dispatched several unmanned reconnaissance ships to T855, deploying satellites into its orbit. These reconnaissance devices had not detected any anomalies on T855, as though no hidden forces were present. If not for the Cat's Ear spaceship's disappearance and the message it transmitted, General Masai might have believed it. However, their mission was not to conquer the barren T855. Since the enemy hadn't revealed themselves, the Reckon felt no rush, focusing on developing T853. The more time passed, the greater their advantage. Once their surface facilities and orbital factories were complete, along with satellite-mounted cannons, eliminating the enemy would be effortless. During this period, the general's attention had been entirely on the progress of the longevity serum, almost forgetting about the T855 forces. That was, until the sudden attack. Why now? Could it be because the two planets were drawing closer? If so, the enemy was concerned about the attack range. Why care about the distance? Unless it was a limitation. This implied their propulsion technology was relatively primitive. Newly emerging space civilizations commonly faced this issue. The Reckon would have as well without external intervention. Between T853 and T855, even at their closest, the planets were nearly 600 million kilometers apart. If the enemy hadn't ventured beyond their star system, their speed likely hadn't reached the system's escape velocity. Based on Recon calculations, the T-85 star system's escape velocity was 17.2 km per second. Even at that speed, traveling from T-855 to T-853 would take over 400 days. Factoring in the planets drifting apart, the journey would take far longer. Why would they attack now? Staying hidden on T-855 and ambushing the Recon fleet seemed a better strategy. Given their advanced stealth technology, such an ambush might have inflicted severe losses. Could it be they weren't targeting the Recon fleet but merely aiming to disable their reconnaissance equipment? Why wait until now? General Masai couldn't understand the reasoning, nor could his captains or advisors decipher the alien civilization's actions. However, since the enemy had the capability for spaceflight, they must have a plan. Still, daring to strike first required a severe counterattack. Under the general's command, the Recon fleet prepared for battle. Energy systems, weaponry, and training routines were checked and executed in a flurry of activity. On Great Ursa planet's satellites, the ground heaved as purple-gray, flesh-like plants emerged from the surface, writhing as though pulling their bodies out from the depths. Gradually, colossal wall-like structures rose, part of the swarm's long-hidden electromagnetic launch systems. These were ground-based versions of the swarm's orbital electromagnetic megastructures, adapted from the fungal carpet template. Ever since the swarm mastered biological fusion reactors, these mini-suns provided enough energy for rapid underground growth. As modular extensions of the fungal carpet, the launch systems could move slowly within its body. One by one, the platforms emerged, their sizes varied but generally spanning over 100 kilometers. On smaller planets, some stretched across half the surface. Massive space squids emerged from their hiding places. Larval and smaller mature bodies burrowed into primordial space octopus bodies. T/N, I don't know why the author started calling them space octopus instead of bioships. These behemoths, each over 500 meters long, lined up to enter the electromagnetic launch platforms, from which they were hurled into space. Chapter 272, Changes. The propulsion system of the swarm, as it stood now, seemed somewhat outdated. Although it surpassed the escape velocity of the neighboring star system, it only reached 50 km per second. In reality, however, this speed was more than sufficient for close-range space combat. Let's not forget, the space octopuses could accelerate to this speed in a short amount of time. The Recon fleet, while capable of flying at approximately 1/5 the speed of light, needed an extended acceleration period to reach that velocity, and that required the activation of specialized engines. Even though this acceleration period was far shorter than when using solar sails, in a space engagement, there wouldn't be time for such prolonged acceleration. Moreover, within a solar system, achieving such high speeds was impossible due to the complexity of the environment. Obstacles abounded, and traveling too fast would lead to collisions and destruction. As such, in terms of short-range agility, the Recon warships might not even be as nimble as the space octopuses. That said, a distance of 600 million kilometers was still a challenging one to traverse quickly. At such distances, it was difficult to effectively threaten the enemy with any form of attack. Both sides needed to close the gap to a certain proximity before combat could erupt. At this juncture, if one side could deceive the other's detection systems and set up an ambush ahead of time, they would gain a significant advantage. However, the opponent had abandoned this advantage and exposed their position. Even if they wanted to launch a surprise attack, they would need to undertake a journey of several hundred days. During this time, the defenders could calmly arrange their defenses and prepare for battle. If the attackers didn't possess overwhelming numbers, such an operation would be tantamount to suicide. This was precisely what puzzled the Recons. Could it be that their opponents were so confident? Indeed, the swarm was extraordinarily confident. The Recons' deployments were being continuously transmitted back to the swarm through Lieutenant Colonel Cross. Never before had the swarm possessed such perfect knowledge of their enemy. The swarm, of course, wouldn't rely solely on their 50 km per second speed for an attack. Their gigantic electromagnetic launchers could accelerate primordial space octopuses to 5,000 km per second, reducing the theoretical travel time from Great Ursa planet to the Recon fleet to just over 1 day. And that calculation even accounted for the necessary deceleration. Without the need to slow down, the journey could be even faster. In practice, it took nearly 3 days for the swarm's forces to reach the Recon fleet, as they began sustained deceleration after traversing half the distance. Even so, this was far beyond what the Recons had imagined. "Captain, T-855 has detected a dense energy burst of exceptionally high intensity. The observer reported in a panicked voice. The previously calm instruments were now blaring alarms like mad, with the display screen covered in a chaotic array of red dots, large and small. What's going on? General Masai demanded, immediately ordering the AI to summon all ship captains to the conference room for a meeting. They're attacking us. Based on earlier deductions, it's their electromagnetic railguns. The T-855 and its satellites are saturated with their railgun strikes, the observer stammered, his voice trembling. Damn it! What was the reconnaissance team doing earlier? Why wasn't anything detected? Where's Malachi? Get him to provide a report immediately. Otherwise, we won't need to wait for the war to start. I'll execute him myself. General Masai roared. Malachi, the officer in charge of reconnaissance, held the rank of lieutenant colonel. His position placed him on equal footing with many of the ship captains, granting him significant authority. Yet this blunder left no room for explanation. Even if General Masai didn't execute him on the spot, Malachi wouldn't escape a court-martial after the war. The Riken's efficiency was commendable. As they had already heightened their alert status, it took only 2 minutes after General Masai's tirade for all participants to join the online meeting room. What's the situation now, General? I heard the enemy is approaching. Didn't earlier reports suggest we had at least 100 days to prepare? A captain questioned the moment General Masai logged into the meeting. This individual was a prominent leader, holding a status equivalent to Major General Porter's. While they usually maintained cordial relations, the war's onset stripped away formalities. Not to mention, Malachi was known to be General Masai's subordinate and rumored to be a relative. With such a gross intelligence failure, everyone present could face significant losses, and it was no surprise that the captain's tone was sharp. General Masai, knowing he was at fault, ignored the captain's criticism and addressed the group instead. The overall situation has already been sent to you. Somehow, the enemy has managed to deceive our reconnaissance. But this is not the time to assign blame. The enemy's attack is imminent. If anyone has any suggestions, speak freely. General, we currently know nothing. Earlier intelligence is likely unreliable. We need new, accurate information before we can analyze the situation, one of the captains responded. Pretending not to hear the implied rebuke, General Masai was about to say something when his adjutant approached and whispered in his ear. After hearing the message, he nodded and said to the screen, "Let's have Lieutenant Colonel Malachi join us. As the officer in charge of reconnaissance, I believe he'll have some first-hand information to share." A new video window appeared on the screen, revealing a middle-aged male Riken with a sharp gaze. He looked visibly displeased, as if caught in a storm not of his making. After straightening his uniform, he began, "Ladies and gentlemen, I admit there were lapses in the intelligence department this time, but the blame doesn't entirely lie with us." From the outset, Lieutenant Colonel Malachi admitted the mistake but quickly hinted that there was more to the story. "Then please explain it to us," said the captain who had earlier questioned General Masai. Though his words were polite, his tone was laced with sarcasm, implying he doubted Malachi's ability to clarify the issue. Malachi nodded. He caught the insinuation but had no retort, his eyes growing colder. "Everyone, please look at these two images." Two comparative images appeared on the screen, showing what appeared to be a distant star system. The left image seemed ordinary, but the right one depicted the same system with extensive purple-gray patches over the planets and moons. Two of the smaller moons were entirely engulfed in this purple-gray color. Although the assembled commanders were high-ranking and prestigious, they were well prepared. If shown only the right image, they might hesitate, but the left image made it clear. It was the T-855 planet and its satellites. Their expressions turned grave. "What happened?" a captain asked. "The left image was taken 10 hours ago. The right image shows their current state," Malachi explained. "Is this real? Why have they changed so drastically? Are there any close-up images?" Chapter 273, Evasion. "No, we don't have any closer images. All observation devices on that side were destroyed. These were taken using the large shipborne telescope on the Scylla's Goddess," Malachi replied, shaking his head. The Scylla's Goddess was a specialized utility ship equipped with a variety of large observational instruments. As for why they've changed so drastically, it's undoubtedly the work of that hidden civilization. While we don't know their exact intentions, it must be related to the energy reactions we've observed. Furthermore, their ability to alter the environments of planets and moons on such a large scale in such a short time is something even we Ricans cannot achieve. This isn't a failure of our intelligence department, it's that their capabilities are beyond our understanding. They're likely far more troublesome than we initially imagined. Though Malachi tried to shift blame, his inherent arrogance still surfaced. He regarded the situation as merely a minor issue evolving into a major one. We indeed lack the means to replicate such feats. Perhaps these abilities are unique to biological civilizations. But what about their electromagnetic railguns? One advisor questioned. What's so strange about that? They have creatures that can spit nuclear bombs, why wouldn't they be able to fire railgun shots? The atomic organs inside those beasts are far more advanced than railguns. Maybe those creatures are just experimental products of their civilization, another captain quipped. That's plausible. Dr. Balt, what's your opinion? The internal structures of those creatures are beyond my expertise. I can't determine whether they're natural or artificial creations. Dr. Balt, lost in thought, hadn't expected the discussion to pivot to him. After a brief consideration, he gave an honest response. I don't think this is the right time to debate that. Ever since the activity on T855, the energy fluctuations haven't stopped. Shouldn't we focus on that instead? One captain interjected, attempting to redirect the conversation. Agreed, another captain chimed in. We don't know the power of their railguns, nor can we estimate the projectile speed, but I suggest the fleet take evasive maneuvers. The fleet will deploy all probes and shift 3,000 kilometers toward coordinate 31.67, General Masai decided, finding the proposal reasonable. After months of idling, the Riken fleet reignited their engines, slowly moving aside. Since railgun projectiles couldn't alter their course mid-flight, leaving their current position should theoretically evade enemy fire. A day later, in the communication room. The enemy's railguns haven't stopped. Their attack is ongoing. We've changed positions 3 times now, and we still can't determine their target. Have the probes detected anything? Not yet. Suddenly, Malachi joined the meeting with new information. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the latest data from our probes, Malachi announced, uploading a series of images and videos to the meeting's main screen. The footage showed deep space, with occasional flashes of blue arcs. What is this? One captain asked, perplexed. It's what the enemy fired at us. Malachi replied. Our probes spotted them. This footage has been slowed down by a factor of 5,000. Based on their trajectory, they'll pass 2,000 kilometers away from the fleet. Those don't look like projectiles. Maybe their projectiles look like this. I'm only seeing some blue arcs. Their stealth technology is extremely advanced. Without those arcs, our probes wouldn't have detected them at all. Are you saying they've added stealth devices to their projectiles? That's quite innovative. Perhaps they should consider masking their railgun energy emissions, it might be even more effective, someone joked. Realizing the projectiles posed no immediate threat, the Riken commanders relaxed, their earlier tension replaced with levity. In reality, the swarm's optical cloaking and electromagnetic signal suppression systems were exceptionally advanced. If it weren't for the plasma engines used for deceleration, which emitted detectable energy signals, the Rikens wouldn't have noticed the space octopuses until they were right on top of them. I have bad news, Malachi interjected. These might not be projectiles. Based on data from the probes, these objects are decelerating. And calculations of their outlines during arc flashes show that each is over 500 meters in size. Unbelievable. If I didn't know better, I'd almost think they launched the meteor that destroyed the Trin-Bryan district, a captain muttered. Could this be a conspiracy by the military? Don't be ridiculous. That's impossible. How long until they're in range? General Masai asked. They're decelerating continuously, but even so, they'll reach 300,000 kilometers from us in about 30 hours within effective range, Malachi replied, glancing at his terminal for the data. No matter what they are, we must destroy them before they get any closer, General Masai declared, glancing at the other captains, who nodded in agreement. He continued, Malachi, your intelligence team has a crucial task ahead. Lock onto all stealth objects and map their trajectories. I'll have the AI assign attack zones based on your data. Understood. The Riken fleet entered intense battle preparations. Their ships bristled with turrets, which now had their purpose. With AI assistance, the stealth objects were targeted one by one, ready to be engaged once within range. So many. The initial scans locked onto over 500 unknown objects in just the first wave. Subsequent waves were estimated to contain another 300 to 400 each, bringing the total to over 2,000. What are these things? I don't like the idea of them being alive. Neither do I. As the time for contact approached, the tension among the Reckons rose. No matter how confident they were, this was their first encounter with an alien civilization. They were making history and the stakes couldn't be higher. Careful! Evade immediately! Malachi's shout rang out suddenly. The enemy, cunning as ever, had launched a barrage of solid projectiles behind the arc-emitting objects. These projectiles, requiring no deceleration, had overtaken the first wave and reached the front. This precision was the result of meticulous calculations. Between bursts of reinforcements, the swarm had launched 2 waves of solid ammunition to provide initial long-range support. Because these smaller projectiles were harder to detect, the Reckons only spotted them when they were nearly upon them. Chapter 274, Space Octopuses. A Reckon warship, over a kilometer in length, would indeed seem massive within a planetary atmosphere. But in the vastness of space, it was little more than a speck in a sea of stars. The projectiles hurtling across the 600-million kilometer expanse had been accurately locked onto the positions of the Reckon fleet at launch. However, after traveling for over a day, subjected to various forces and minute deviations, the chances of actually hitting their targets were slim. Despite their emergency evasive maneuvers, one of the Reckon warships sustained damage to its left armor, forcing it to withdraw for emergency repairs. This was the sole casualty among the hundreds of projectiles launched. While the bombardment yielded little in terms of direct damage, it disrupted the Reckon fleet's defensive formations. In their scramble to evade, several turrets lost their original firing angles, leaving some targets out of reach. Space combat was inherently a three-dimensional battlefield. It required accounting for enemies from every angle above, below, to the sides and factoring in the ship's orientation and the risk of obstructing Allied vessels. The complexity was immense. After a rapid calculation, the fleet's AI adjusted the turrets, redistributing targets based on the new formation. Fire. Launch. As soon as the unidentified objects entered effective range, the Reckon fleet unleashed their firepower. Over 300 warships, armed with more than 2,000 high-powered main turrets, unleashed several salvos, filling the void with tens of thousands of energy beams. The starry expanse lit up spectacularly as the dense barrage of beams cut through space. The projectiles weren't passive targets. Blue arcs of plasma surged across their surfaces as their plasma engine organs fired at full capacity, allowing them to execute evasive maneuvers. The Reckons were dumbfounded. What the hell are these things? They're too far and too nimble. Our long-range attacks are ineffective. Then we'll have to wait until they get closer. A few minutes later, the Reckon fleet launched a second attack. With the targets now closer, and having refined their algorithms after the first round, the Reckons managed to hit over a dozen projectiles despite the evasive efforts. The struck projectiles exploded like fireworks, but their destruction only released a greater threat. From their ruptured forms poured countless octopus-like organisms. Some were only a few meters long, while others spanned tens of meters. These creatures scattered like a burst of fluid, their bodies flickering with blue arcs of plasma. In a flash, they leaped onto nearby projectiles, merging into their surfaces and disappearing from sight. What the hell are those? This question, repeated countless times over the past 2 days, echoed once more among the Reckons, who were increasingly overwhelmed by bewilderment. Could these be their warships? A strategist tentatively speculated. Are you saying they're launching their warships at us? Then what are those things inside them? Pilots. They look similar, but the size difference is enormous. A flurry of questions filled the Reckon fleet's communication channels, but speculation didn't delay their next orders to attack. After several more salvos, over 200 of the incoming projectiles were destroyed. Yet, more than half broke through the firepower barrier, closing to within 50,000 kilometers of the Reckon fleet. Moreover, the contents of the destroyed projectiles had already spilled out, significantly reducing the swarm's actual losses. Now within the range of the Reckon fleet's medium-range weapons, the remaining projectiles faced a new barrage. The fleet's secondary turrets, numbering over 10,000, unleashed an even denser barrage of energy beams. While the projectiles maneuvered desperately, their 500-meter-plus bodies proved less agile as the distance narrowed. Coupled with the overwhelming intensity of the Reckon firepower, they were systematically destroyed. These primordial space octopuses, stripped of their electromagnetic railgun components to increase their carrying capacity before launch, were purely transport units. Their destruction merely signaled the beginning of the true battle. The projectiles were entirely eliminated before they could close to 30,000 kilometers, but this only paved the way for a much larger wave of attackers. Following the destruction of the large projectiles, countless smaller ones swarmed forward, their numbers several times if not tens of times greater. Blue arcs of plasma crackled across their forms as they accelerated toward the Wrecking fleet with astonishing speed. At 30,000 kilometers, the space octopuses needed only about 10 minutes to cross the distance at maximum velocity. Their energy reserves were sufficient to support low-intensity combat at such a range. However, the scale of this battle far exceeded low intensity. Energy conservation remained a priority. At their maximum energy output, the octopuses could no longer maintain their cloaking capabilities, revealing themselves to the Wreckins for the first time. "What are those things?" repeated endlessly. "Are these some kind of biological civilization's combat units? They look alive. Stop analyzing, they're coming in. Prepare the space torpedoes." The Wreckin fleet's defenses were thorough. Long-range main turrets, medium-range secondary turrets, torpedoes for medium-close combat, and close-range defensive formations created an intricate web of protection. Although not the most advanced technology in the Wreckin arsenal, the space torpedoes were effective within a limited range. Equipped with tracking systems, they provided strong offensive and defensive capabilities and were widely deployed across Wreckin warships. Hidden launch bays opened across the fleet, and sleek, slender missiles were ejected. As they fired, their propulsion systems ignited, and with the aid of the fleet's AI, the missiles locked onto their targets. Trailing long tails of exhaust, they streaked toward the oncoming swarm. Despite their speed, the torpedoes were still slower than energy beams and barely faster than the space octopuses. This limited their effectiveness. The octopuses, equipped with extreme dynamic vision, skillfully evaded the torpedoes. Some even lashed out with their tentacles, entwining the missiles. However, Wreckin technology ensured that physical impact wasn't necessary for detonation. Each torpedo carried a proximity fuse. Boom! 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 Brilliant explosions lit up the void, obliterating or wounding some of the more daring octopuses. Guided by their knights, the space octopuses quickly adapted, keeping their distance from the flaming projectiles. At their speed, dodging these weapons was hardly a challenge. Chapter 275, Space Warfare. But the Wreckin missiles weren't limited to simple tracking. Anticipating potential evasive maneuvers during their design, the Wreckin AI adapted quickly. Utilizing the computational power of a regional network formed by all warships and support vessels, it implemented a new strategy. 2 missiles approached a space octopus from above and below. Just as the octopus attempted to dodge, one of the missiles exploded unexpectedly, engulfing the creature in fire. The other octopuses, observing this, immediately distanced themselves from the missiles, refusing to allow them close. However, evading the missiles restricted their flight paths. One space octopus, entirely focused on dodging, found itself trapped when 2 energy beams suddenly intersected, sealing off all escape routes. It was obliterated in mid-air. In battles where the weaponry of both sides is relatively equal, victory often comes down to information and computational power. At this moment, while the Wreckins held a slight advantage in computational ability, their intelligence was woefully inadequate. The swarm's biological technologies had their weaknesses, but also undeniable strengths. These space octopuses were not expendable cannon fodder. They were valuable space combat units. Even those destroyed in battle hadn't truly died. Derived from fungal carpets, their bodies were filled with fungal colonies capable of acting as network nodes. As long as some of these colonies survived, the space octopuses could regenerate. Floating in space, absorbing radiation to replenish energy, they could gradually recover even from being blown apart. Though the process was slow, they could accelerate recovery by absorbing parts of each other. As long as the swarm controlled the battlefield after the battle, their forces would grow ever stronger. To annihilate a swarm force entirely, one would need not only to win the battle but also to thoroughly clean up the battlefield. This reality was entirely unknown to the Wreckins. And with the swarm's reinforcements arriving in a constant stream, the Wreckins would neither outlast the swarm nor have an opportunity to clear the field. Nonetheless, this wave of torpedo missile attacks disrupted the swarm's offensive momentum, rendering at least 20% of the space octopus's combat ineffective. This kind of war was a first not only for the Wreckins but also for the swarm. Overall, the battle served as a trial for the swarm space combat units, a chance to identify weaknesses and refine their strategies. At this stage, there was no need to worry about hidden observers. If the swarm wished to step onto the grand stage of the cosmos, such technologies would inevitably come to light sooner or later. Luo Wen would not cripple the swarm's development by pretending to be a lesser power just to avoid the scrutiny of potential advanced civilizations. What the swarm needed to conceal was not its natural technological progress, but those abilities originating from another world, abilities unique to the swarm. This referred to the swarm network, whose foundation lay in extraordinary powers from another realm. In this world, it was the swarm's core strength and absolutely must not be exposed. To this end, every space combat unit, regardless of size, was equipped with information receiving systems. These systems, based on bent light transmissions, originated from the mantis shrimp of the Genesis planet. By utilizing millions of color combinations to transmit data, and more than 20 primary color capture systems to receive it, they enabled communication through visual cues. In addition, electromagnetic waves, body gestures, and other communication modes were integrated, allowing the swarm to coordinate seamlessly in battle. Of course, this was all for external appearances. In truth, command and coordination were still executed through the swarm network. These systems were essential for deception. If the enemy captured a swarm combat unit amid the chaos and found no apparent communication systems upon dissection, it would immediately raise questions. How could such units operate in sync without a visible means of coordination? Overlord, our space octopuses are too weak at breaking through their firepower barriers, Sarah Kerrigan noted. That can't be helped, Morgan sighed. After all, we still lack enough atomic furnaces. Indeed, if all mature space octopuses were equipped with atomic furnaces, their endurance would see a qualitative leap. They wouldn't need to rely on such reckless charges, instead advancing while providing suppressive fire with their electromagnetic railguns. Fortunately, the primordial space octopuses, though destroyed, had preserved their atomic furnaces intact. During assaults, the furnaces were concealed in the rearmost sections of their bodies. Even if the Recon's main cannons penetrated their forward armor, the residual energy of the beams would be absorbed by the cargo they carried, other space octopuses, before reaching the furnaces. For each destroyed primordial unit, a mature octopus would retrieve and secure its atomic furnace. These mature units would refrain from combat, activating cloaking systems and suppressing all energy emissions to drift silently through space. This made them nearly impossible to detect, ensuring the precious furnaces could be safely recovered post-battle. We don't calculate losses like other civilizations do. Our only goal is to win the war. When we do, losses cease to matter, Luo Wen declared. Biotechnology and mechanical technology each had their advantages. For mechanical civilizations, repairing damaged warships was a complex and resource-intensive process. Often, rebuilding a ship required fewer resources than repairing one. For the swarm, such concerns were irrelevant. Injuries merely required time to heal. After losing half their forces, the space octopuses finally broke through the firepower barriers, closing to within 1,000 kilometers of the Recon fleet, a near point-blank range in space combat. However, the remaining octopuses were mostly larval bodies under 20 meters in length, with a few mature ones at most reaching 50 meters. The larger units had all been prioritized and eliminated earlier. Deploy the fighters to intercept. General Masai ordered. A dense swarm of fighters poured out of the Recon fleet's hangars. Each warship launched at least 500 units, bringing the total to nearly 20,000. Among these fighters, a minority measuring over 8 meters in length were piloted by live Recon pilots. The rest, 5 meters long, were drones. Each piloted fighter directed 9 drones, forming a squadron of 10 under the pilot's command, with AI assistance. These squadrons operated in tight coordination, providing mutual support and executing precise attacks. The sheer number of fighters dwarfed the remaining space octopuses, instantly granting the Recons a numerical advantage. Chapter 276, Dogfights. The Recon fighter craft were equipped with 2 to 4 energy weapons and carried 4 space torpedoes. Due to their size, these energy weapons had smaller calibers, requiring concentrated fire to pose a threat to the space octopuses. Nonetheless, their sheer numbers made their long-range firepower formidable. But the Recons made a critical mistake: their fighters charged directly toward the swarm space octopuses. Had they maintained distance, using long-range firepower to steadily wear down the space octopuses and disrupt their evasive maneuvers, while coordinating with the main and secondary turrets of their warships, the octopuses would have struggled to prevail. Instead, their decision to close the distance played right into the swarm's hands. Although the mechanical fighters were highly maneuverable, with thrusters at their tails and undersides for propulsion and directional changes, they were no match for the octopuses in terms of agility. In the void of space, the octopuses moved like sea creatures gliding through water, their countless tentacles acting as thrust mechanisms to shift directions or halt abruptly at will. While the Reichen fighters managed to shoot down a few octopuses during their charge, the moment the two forces clashed, the battle shifted dramatically. The space octopuses weaved effortlessly through the Reichen fighter formations. Their tentacles latched onto nearby craft, gripping them tightly and tearing them apart. The Reichen drones, mass-produced and lightly armored, could withstand the octopus's initial tugs. But with a deliberate sacrifice of one or two tentacles, an octopus could pierce their engines, turning the drones into floating space debris. This strategy, however, was not without cost, and the knights piloting the octopuses quickly devised a more refined method of attack. Instead of directly attacking the fighters, the octopuses clung to the craft, using their bodies as shields to lure in enemy fire. When a space torpedo or energy beam targeted the host fighter, the octopus would detach at the last moment, leaving the unlucky craft to be struck by its own allies' weapons. This tactic left the Reichens paralyzed. Firing torpedoes became a liability, and they were forced to hold back. But the octopuses weren't done. They clung to the fighters, using their strength to redirect the craft's trajectories, causing collisions with allied units. As soft-bodied creatures, the octopuses exhibited extraordinary adhesive capabilities. They could move fluidly across a fighter's surface, from the top to the underside, rendering targeting by other Reichen fighters nearly impossible. Some octopuses even wrenched off the external torpedoes mounted on the fighters, hurling them back at the Reichens with devastating precision. The Reichen commander's decision to engage in close combat quickly turned the battlefield into chaos. The octopuses thrived in the disarray, using the enemy fighters as cover while taunting their opponents relentlessly. The Reichen fighters, hesitant to fire and restricted in their maneuvers, became sitting ducks. Even the warship's main and secondary turrets ceased firing for fear of hitting their own forces. "Pull the fighters back!" General Masai barked, his frustration boiling over. The swarm's unorthodox tactics left him humiliated in front of his peers. The Reichen pilots, already desperate to escape the increasingly untenable situation, eagerly complied. They turned their fighters and retreated. But the battlefield was not so easily abandoned. The octopuses latched onto the retreating fighters like stowaways on a transport ship, hitching a ride back toward the Reichen fleet. Realizing the danger, the Reichens issued an emergency order. This time, they prioritized eliminating the octopuses regardless of collateral damage. The drones carrying octopus passengers were targeted in a sudden, ruthless assault. The octopuses were caught off guard and suffered heavy losses. Only the octopuses attached to piloted fighters managed to survive the onslaught. The swarm had not anticipated the Reichens' willingness to sacrifice thousands of drones to eliminate their enemies. It was a pragmatic choice, otherwise, the octopuses clinging to the fighters would eventually incapacitate the entire group. However, the Reichens' determination was not absolute. Hundreds of operational octopuses still remained, using piloted fighters for cover. These survivors continued to harass the fleet, preventing the fighters from fully retreating. At that moment, the swarm's second wave of reinforcements arrived on the battlefield. The Reichen warships redirected their main and secondary turrets to face the incoming threat. This wave of swarm forces brought a slightly different configuration. Among the 500 primordial space octopuses, 400 served as troop carriers, while the remaining 100 were armed with at least 2 electromagnetic railguns each, providing long-range fire support from the rear. The railguns were particularly menacing at this range. Their projectiles reached the Reichen fleet in just over a minute, too short a time for the massive warships to evade. Moreover, the energy emissions generated by the octopuses during their maneuvers closely resembled those produced by the railguns. In the chaotic battlefield environment, the Reichens' detection systems failed to distinguish the railgun attacks immediately. The first volley of over 100 projectiles struck with devastating effect, catching the Reichens off guard. The forwardmost warships bore the brunt of the assault. Despite their thick frontal armor, the power of the primordial octopus's railguns was immense. Each railgun was over 300 meters in length, firing projectiles with diameters exceeding 1 meter. The impact was catastrophic. 2 warships had their forward sections obliterated by the kinetic energy alone, while several others sustained severe damage. Alarms blared throughout the damaged vessels. Emergency protocols sealed off compromised compartments, but the destruction was severe. In the vacuum of space, individual survival became insignificant. Many Reckon crew members were blown out through breaches in the hull. Those wearing protective suits fared slightly better, but those in standard uniforms faced imminent death. As nearby warships scrambled to rescue the survivors, the swarm's second volley arrived. Chapter 277, Infiltration. Before the second wave of bombardment, the Reckons had learned from their earlier losses and made subtle adjustments to their detection systems. The fleet focused its attention on the rear of the swarm's second wave, keeping a close watch on the over 100 primordial space octopuses stationed there. Thus, when these massive units began charging energy for their next attack, the fleet received an immediate evasive order. However, the Reckon warships that had been severely damaged in the first round of bombardment either lost mobility or could only move sluggishly. In wars between civilizations, mercy is a rarity. Rather than wounding 10 fingers, it's better to sever one entirely, a principle Luo Wen had drilled into his blades countless times. As a result, these crippled warships were given special attention in the second round of strikes. One heavily damaged ship was utterly destroyed, its energy core detonating and turning the vessel into a shower of debris. The shrapnel sprayed in all directions, colliding with nearby ships and disrupting ongoing rescue operations. The Reckons drifting in space from the first attack faced an even bleaker fate. The scene became a grim spectacle. More small rescue craft were deployed to assist, but before they could reach the field, the third wave of bombardment arrived. The Reckons, still reeling, finally adjusted their tactics. They redirected their main guns to target the 100 primordial octopuses at long range. These massive units were so far away that only the main guns could reach them. However, this redirection of firepower allowed other primordial octopuses to breach the firepower net more easily. Their enormous size let them withstand multiple hits from the secondary turrets before going down. The third layer of defense space torpedoes was now noticeably thinner. Unlike energy weapons, torpedoes required physical reloading, and many launchers were still in the process of being rearmed. The fourth defensive line of fighter craft remained embroiled in skirmishes with the remnants of the first wave of octopuses. By the time the 400 primordial octopuses broke through the fourth line, dozens of them still retained mobility. They were joined by hundreds of mature and over 5,000 larval bodies. The mature bodies, many armed with electromagnetic railguns, began closing the distance while targeting the Reckon fleet's main and secondary turrets. The larval bodies, lacking ranged attack capabilities, rushed toward the fleet, acting as both a distraction and a screen. The Reckon fire control system prioritized the larger primordial and mature octopuses, leaving minimal firepower to deal with the larval bodies. At just 10 meters in length, these small and agile units were difficult to lock onto, zipping through space with unpredictable trajectories. Exploiting this oversight, the larval bodies effortlessly reached the Reckon fleet. Now, the battle entered a phase of close-quarters combat. At this critical juncture, the Reckons activated their fifth line of defense. Numerous multi-barreled close-in weapon systems, CIWS, mounted on the warships sprang to life. These weapons, designed for short-range defense, could fire tens of thousands of rounds per minute, creating a dense curtain of fire. While the CIWS lacked power and had a short effective range, they were perfect for dealing with the larval bodies. The resulting barrage lit up the void with streaks of light, and for the first time since the battle began, the swarm suffered notable casualties. Several larval bodies, unable to evade the wall of fire, were shredded into pulp. Being small creatures with limited fungal colonies, these units had no chance of recovery. Even so, their remains could still be absorbed by other octopuses, accelerating growth and regeneration. The CIWS system relied on AI to predict flight paths and project a lethal trajectory in front of its targets. This approach worked well against less agile mechanical units. However, after some initial losses, the larval bodies adapted. They began zigzagging erratically, rendering their movements unpredictable. Once they adopted this new strategy, their casualties plummeted. Though the CIWS network continued firing ceaselessly, it achieved diminishing results. The larval bodies sought out gaps in the firepower and, after several maneuvers, successfully breached the defenses, landing directly on the warships. While the larval bodies lacked the weaponry to penetrate the ship's heavy armor, they quickly proved their utility. Some swarmed the exposed turrets, ripping apart smaller installations like point defense cannons through brute force. Against the heavily armored main and secondary turrets, the larval bodies employed a different strategy, burrowing directly into the cannon barrels. Being soft-bodied creatures, squeezing through tight spaces was a trivial task. Once inside, their presence caused catastrophic backfires when energy was discharged, disabling the turrets entirely. Although the larval bodies were annihilated in the process, the exchange was entirely in the swarm's favor. Recognizing the threat, General Masai issued an emergency order to prioritize defending the turrets. The CIWS systems were redirected to focus on the turrets instead of creating a firepower net. Since the main and secondary turrets were immune to CIWS fire, friendly fire was not a concern. However, this shift in priorities made the overall CIWS network more porous, allowing more octopuses to slip through. While the turrets gained some protection, the CIWS units themselves became vulnerable. Their relatively weak armor made them easy targets for the larger larval bodies, which dismantled them piece by piece. By targeting the rotating bases of the CIWS units, the larval bodies quickly rendered the weapons inoperable. Without the ability to adjust their firing angles, the CIWS units became non-threatening. Meanwhile, other larval bodies took a more audacious approach. They infiltrated the wreckage of destroyed Riken warships, blending in with the rescue operations in an attempt to sneak aboard intact vessels. Despite the Riken's efforts to shut down hangar bay doors, some larval bodies managed to slip inside before the closures. Inside the ships, these small creatures from space became towering giants. Capable of tearing apart CIWS units, these larval bodies were unstoppable against the unarmed Riken crew. Most of the personnel in the hangars were engineers wielding repair tools, wholly unprepared for combat. The once secure rear areas of the ship were suddenly transformed into frontline battle zones. Chaos erupted as the larval bodies crushed several crew members before reinforcements arrived. The surviving crew fled in terror, colliding with armed soldiers rushing to contain the threat. The resulting scene was one of pure pandemonium. Chapter 278, Detonation. While larval bodies are among the most basic of the swarm space combat units, they are still formidable space soldiers, far superior to many ground forces. To the Riken armed soldiers now facing them, the larval bodies each over 10 meters long were towering giants. Combined with their unique physiology, the Riken's small-caliber energy weapons had a negligible impact on them. Especially within the confines of a warship, where the use of heavy weaponry was restricted, the Rikens were at a significant disadvantage. Chaos reigned as the larval bodies barreled through. In the cramped corridors, their sheer mass alone caused catastrophic injuries to the Rikens. Blue blood spattered the walls of the passageways, mingling with severed limbs and broken bodies. Cries of pain, curses, and screams filled the air. But the larval bodies didn't pause to finish off their victims. Instead, they split up, each following different routes deeper into the ship, causing as much damage as possible without lingering in one spot. 17 larval bodies had infiltrated the ship. They rampaged down corridors, smashing equipment and wreaking havoc, never remaining in any one area for long. The ship's commander urgently ordered all bulkhead doors sealed to contain them. Yet the larval bodies, being soft-bodied creatures, were undeterred. Despite their massive size, they could squeeze into ventilation shafts as narrow as half a meter in diameter. While their progress slowed significantly in the ducts, and their agility was reduced, the ventilation system offered them a critical advantage. It was a blind spot in the ship's defenses. Inside the ducts lay numerous critical cables and pipelines. The larval bodies didn't bother discerning their purposes, they simply yanked them apart. Sparks flew, and electrical surges crackled as high-voltage lines were severed. For most creatures, this might have been fatal, but the larval bodies thrived on electromagnetism. The current caused minor burns but replenished their energy reserves. The Riken warships, mass-produced under tight deadlines, had standardized designs. The swarm had long since obtained their blueprints through Lieutenant Colonel Cross. The larval bodies' seemingly haphazard paths were anything but random. Their chaotic behavior was a deliberate smokescreen to avoid suspicion after the fact. If they headed directly for key systems from the start, it could raise unnecessary questions. Luo Wen understood that in wars between advanced civilizations, even the smallest details could provide valuable intelligence. Of the 17 larval bodies, 15 truly roamed aimlessly, while 2 began to subtly converge on the ship's energy core. The Rikens quickly noticed the 2 larval bodies approaching the core. Knowing its critical importance, they dispatched a large contingent of armed soldiers to intercept them. The larval bodies engaged in brief skirmishes before retreating to the corridors, where they emitted silent, ultrasonic screeches. This was a new capability added after earlier swarm units had encountered setbacks. Ultrasound waves traveled swiftly through the ship's ducts, summoning their nearby brethren, who promptly reversed course to assist. The swarm orchestrated these events like a carefully choreographed play. The intent was to mislead the Reckons into believing the energy core was a key objective. If the larval bodies had moved too precisely and decisively, the Reckons might have questioned how the swarm could have known their ship's layout without prior infiltration. Such knowledge would have raised alarm bells. By feigning disorganization and then rallying toward a plausible target, the swarm maintained the illusion of cunning intelligence without omniscience. Outside the energy core, the Recon soldiers struggled to hold their ground. Their energy weapons, while effective against some targets, fared poorly against the larval bodies, which possessed high resistance to such attacks. Conversely, the confined corridors worked to the larval bodies' advantage. The swarm units lined up in a single file, forming what could only be described as a living train. The larval body at the front bore the brunt of the Recon firepower. Despite its resilience, it was quickly torn apart, its limbs shattered and much of its body evaporated by concentrated fire. But the train consisted of 17 cars. When the lead unit fell, the next one seamlessly took its place, carrying the momentum forward. Such coordinated sacrifice would require elite discipline in an individualistic species. For the swarm, it was merely standard procedure. The train accelerated, barreling through the Recon defenses. Even before the second unit was fully incapacitated, the line smashed into the Recon soldiers and breached the energy core. Once inside, the larval bodies unleashed a storm of destruction. They smashed, tore, and dismantled everything within reach. The Recon soldiers arriving in support found themselves unable to fire for fear of further damaging the core. The energy core, central to the ship's operations, began to destabilize as the destruction continued. Small explosions erupted intermittently, signaling the reactor's imminent failure. The ship's captain, watching the chaos unfold through surveillance feeds, realized the situation was irreparable. With no options left, he issued the order to abandon ship. The crew, including the soldiers who had tried to defend the core, scrambled to evacuate. Whether they reached escape pods depended on how quickly they moved. In the midst of the chaos, the injured were left behind. A brilliant explosion lit up the void as the ship reached its breaking point. The blast originated from the energy core, tearing the vessel apart from the inside out. Fragments of the ship scattered in all directions, accompanied by escape pods, gunboats, and transport craft. Most of the fleeing vessels survived the explosion, though many sustained damage. Some unfortunate pods lost propulsion and drifted aimlessly, carried by the shockwave of the blast. Nearby rescue ships deployed grappling cables to secure these drifting vessels, but the survivors faced a new dilemma. The destruction caused by a mere 17 larval bodies highlighted the vulnerability of Recon warships to internal sabotage. These relatively basic swarm units had proven devastating once inside. Worse yet, the Recons had seen how the larval bodies infiltrated their ship. Though their escape pods now hovered in space, no Recon warship dared open its doors to bring them aboard. As the survivors hesitated, the swarm's third wave over 500 primordial space octopuses arrived on the battlefield. Chapter 279, A Reminder. The newly arrived wave of primordial space octopuses brought a fresh change in deployment. Among them, 200 were equipped with electromagnetic railguns, joining the 30 or so surviving units from the previous wave in providing long-range fire support. This drastically increased the swarm's long-range firepower, while the Recon's firepower had diminished significantly. With warships destroyed by bombardment or sabotaged by blocked turrets, their ability to retaliate was no longer what it once was. The primordial octopuses positioned for long-range assault could now only be threatened by the Recon warship's main cannons. As the balance tipped in the swarm's favor, their long-range firepower soon matched that of the Recons. However, this equality only applied to the mid-range exchange. The Recon fleet's second line of secondary turrets still maintained a semblance of effectiveness, but their third and fourth lines of defense were riddled with gaps from earlier assaults by the mature bodies and larval bodies. Moreover, while the secondary turrets could still provide some resistance, their firepower was no longer a lethal threat to the primordial octopuses. Using data to illustrate. A single main cannon shot could penetrate a primordial body's armor and render it adrift with 3 or 4 hits. In contrast, a secondary turret needed 5 or 6 direct hits to breach the armor and far more to disable a primordial octopus entirely. Yet, primordial bodies were no sitting targets. Hitting the same spot multiple times in succession was a daunting challenge. With the main cannons occupied suppressing the distant primordial bodies, only scattered shots could target the transport-oriented primordial bodies breaching the secondary lines. As a result, of the over 300 transport units in this wave, only a dozen or so were lost before breaking through. This was a dire situation not just for the Reckons but for the swarm as well. Luo Wen hadn't expected the seemingly mighty Recon warships to falter so quickly. By the second wave of reinforcements, their defenses were already collapsing. The Reckons had no effective countermeasures for close-range combat against the space octopuses. Although the second wave of larval bodies had suffered heavy losses to the CIWS, over 1,000 still swarmed around the Recon fleet. The CIWS systems themselves were now heavily damaged. A mere 17 larval bodies infiltrating a single warship had managed to destroy it from within, leaving the Reckons so wary that they even avoided retrieving escape pods. Despite all this, the Recon situation continued to deteriorate. Many warships were damaged by the primordial octopus's long-range bombardment, creating breaches that allowed more larval bodies to infiltrate. Escape pods began launching from several warships. Though only 2 of the fleet's 300 warships were completely destroyed, over 100 suffered varying degrees of damage. Worse still, the remaining transport-type primordial bodies had broken through the secondary defenses. The implications were dire. Each of these transports carried at least thousands of mature bodies and tens of thousands of larval bodies. Recon warships, measuring just over a kilometer long, paled in comparison to the 500-meter-plus primordial octopuses. Even without electromagnetic railguns, their tentacles alone posed a catastrophic threat. If the transport units reached the fleet, the remaining warships would fall in no time even without reinforcements from subsequent waves. Yet, the swarm had already launched 15 waves of primordial bodies, all en route to the battlefield. Even if the swarm ceased further reinforcements, the forces already deployed were more than enough to annihilate the Recon fleet. But Luo Wen's true objective wasn't to destroy the fleet entirely. He had prepared for a hard-fought battle, going all out from the start. If not for the limited number of electromagnetic launchers, even more troops would have reached the field by now. To his surprise, the Recon fleet was already on the verge of collapse before he could bring his full strength to bear. Luo Wen found himself hoping the Reckons had some secret weapon left to deploy. If you've got any trump cards, use them already, he thought. At this rate, the whole thing is becoming farcical. As if in answer to his prayer or perhaps spurred by their recognition of the looming threat, the Reckons revealed their ace. General Masai gave the order, and hundreds of strategic nuclear missiles were launched from the fleet. These weren't the tactical nuclear weapons used by ground forces but super nukes with yields exceeding 200 megatons each. The missiles detonated as they neared the primordial octopus formations. While the octopuses had a chance to evade the blasts, Luo Wen saw an opportunity to leverage the event, orchestrating a delayed reaction from the swarm. In truth, the outcome would have been the same regardless. The explosions were unimaginably powerful. Even if the octopuses had moved earlier, their survival would have been unlikely. The dazzling nuclear explosions illuminated space, lingering like hundreds of miniature suns. Some of the swarm's optical observation units suffered severe damage. The primordial formations directly facing the blasts were vaporized. The resulting radiation belt spanned thousands of kilometers, temporarily cutting off the Recon fleet from the swarm's reinforcements. The intense light, heat, and charged particles from the explosions first struck the Recon fleet. The EMP effects generated by hundreds of high-yield nuclear detonations were catastrophic, disabling many of the fleet's electronic systems. Fortunately, the Reckons had anticipated some collateral effects and initiated emergency protocols, shutting down vulnerable systems to prevent irreparable damage. Even so, smaller units, fighters, escape pods, and drones were rendered inoperable. Without rescue, these crews faced suffocation and starvation in the void. The explosion's effects weren't limited to space. On the nearby Great Dawn planet, shockwaves wreaked havoc on the atmosphere, triggering massive tidal storms, earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions. The planet's magnetic field became unstable, further exacerbating the chaos. The Reckons' initial confidence in their superior technology had been shattered by the swarm's relentless assault. After the first wave, their arrogance faltered. After the second, their morale crumbled entirely. Some had already proposed retreat, but the realization of the swarm's full scale of reinforcements solidified their decision. This was Luo Wen's deliberate ploy, a display of the swarm's might designed to terrify his opponents into fleeing. Convinced they had narrowly escaped annihilation, the Reckons prepared to withdraw, believing the heavens had offered them a second chance. Chapter 280, Escape. The proposal to retreat was swiftly approved. At Lieutenant Colonel Cross's reminder, they ensured that no Recon clansmen were left behind on Great Dawn planet. On Great Dawn planet, all personnel from various bases carried out an emergency evacuation. Bases, supplies, and all kinds of useless weaponry and equipment were abandoned or destroyed. Dr. Balt's laboratory had to leave behind the intact corpse of Godzilla, taking only some tissue samples. The longevity plants, however, were the top priority and the greatest reward of their mission. These plants were carefully placed into petri dishes and loaded onto transport ships. As for the experimental equipment, all of it was destroyed. The airships then took off in haste, heading toward the fleet in orbit. At that moment, the sky lit up with hundreds of suns. Fortunately, the Riken transport ships had not yet exited the atmosphere, and the atmospheric barrier significantly reduced the impact they suffered. Without this, they might have ended up like the escape pods blown away to some unknown place. The nuclear explosions temporarily halted the subsequent attacks of the swarm forces. The Rikens, demonstrating their resolve, abandoned several warships already infested with larval bodies, activated the self-destruct systems, and urgently transferred personnel. After picking up the transport ships that had flown up from Great Dawn Planet, the entire fleet fired up their engines and fled in the opposite direction of the battlefield. Seeing that the Rikens successfully escaped, Luo Wen exhaled deeply. He hadn't expected the Riken fleet to be as fragile as they turned out to be, even bordering on pathetic. It seemed their technological advancements primarily focused on engines, fleet construction, and materials, while their weapons technology had barely progressed. Their combat capabilities were laughably poor. Meanwhile, the Rikens, seeing that the swarm forces had not pursued them further, assumed that the radiation from the nuclear blasts had genuinely stopped the swarm. They too breathed a sigh of relief, feeling as though they had narrowly escaped death. In truth, the radiation could not stop the swarm. After the high temperatures dissipated, the area essentially became a massive charging station for the swarm. If not for the fact that the Rikens hadn't gotten far, Luo Wen would have already ordered the immobile space octopuses from the earlier battle to be dragged over for rapid recovery. Shortly after the Rikens set sail, the swarm's seventh wave of primordial body units reached the battlefield. The charade couldn't be too obvious. Once the radiation belt between the two forces had cooled slightly, the swarm organized over 2,000 primordial body units to cross the belt and chase after the Riken fleet. Though the swarm's engine technology lagged behind that of the Rikens, many of the Riken warships had sustained damage from earlier bombardments. While they could manage at low speeds, they became unstable and prone to structural failure at high velocities. Yet, with the swarm in pursuit, the Rikens dared not reduce their speed. Along the path of the pursuit, Riken warships heavily damaged in the battle were occasionally abandoned. Most of the Rikens aboard these ships had already been transferred. However, as the pursuit wore on, more warships began falling behind the main fleet. These warships were less severely damaged but were unable to keep up with the fleet's accelerating pace. The main fleet's speed had increased to the point where transferring personnel from damaged warships was almost impossible. Yet, if they continued flying under these overburdened conditions, the warships would inevitably fail or be overtaken by the swarm. Fortunately, these less damaged warships decided to break away from the main fleet and fend for themselves. This small splinter fleet headed for planet T854, the first planet they had encountered upon arriving in the T85 star system. They still had defensive forces, space factories, and resource collection equipment there. By lingering there briefly, they hoped to repair their warships and then return home. Now, they could only hope the swarm, distracted by the larger Riken fleet, would ignore this small group. If Lieutenant Colonel Cross and the Seeds were part of this splinter fleet, the swarm would naturally follow the larger group, abandoning their pursuit of the splinter fleet. Unfortunately, during the earlier battle, Lieutenant Colonel Cross's ship had already been marked. Whether from the long-range bombardments of the primordial bodies or the harassment by mature and larval bodies, her area had been conspicuously avoided. Moreover, when Dr. Balt's team received the evacuation order, the Rikens had already decided to retreat. Naturally, the team carrying the precious longevity plants would not be placed on a damaged warship. In the early stages of the retreat, the team had already transferred to General Masai's flagship. This information had been confirmed by Lieutenant Colonel Cross. Thus, the unfortunate splinter fleet attracted the attention of the swarm's pursuing forces. The swarm abandoned their pursuit of the rapidly accelerating main Riken fleet and instead turned their attention to this smaller fleet. Watching the swarm cease its pursuit, General Masai felt a heavy weight lift from his chest, though a trace of sorrow remained. Their sacrifice was worth it, he murmured as he watched the surveillance footage of the damaged fleet being surrounded by the swarm. It was unclear whether he was trying to convince himself or absolve his guilt. However, no one was more reluctant to see this outcome than General Masai. As the nominal commander of the expeditionary force, this operation had been a disastrous failure. Not only had they lost numerous warships, but they had also suffered heavy personnel losses, retreating in utter defeat. Now, they could only hope Dr. Balt would make the most of their journey home and enhance the value of their findings. The Riken fleet had dwindled from 315 main warships and 164 transport ships, carrying over 3 million personnel, to 206 main warships, 127 transport ships, and just over 2.4 million personnel. The war had taken a significant toll on their primary warships, with fewer than 10 destroyed outright in battle. Most were abandoned during strategic withdrawals. Personnel losses were also severe, though proportionally less than the losses of main warships. As a result, many warships and transport ships had taken in personnel who were not originally part of their crews. These were mostly survivors transferred from heavily damaged warships abandoned early in the conflict. While their supplies were barely sufficient to sustain these numbers for the return journey, they faced a shortage of about 200,000 stasis pods. As a result, some would have to spend a portion of the monotonous interstellar journey awake, wasting a part of their lifespans. Naturally, Dr. Balt's team wouldn't face such issues. Although they lacked stasis pods, they wouldn't experience boredom. Their research into longevity plants would occupy their time. Due to the sudden nature of the retreat, they had managed to bring a large number of harvested longevity plants. However, these plants were now like water without a source. If they couldn't find a way to propagate them, their supply would eventually run out. Returning to T853 to harvest more was impossible in the short term. Thus, Dr. Balt's team had to focus not only on removing the plant's side effects but also on discovering a method to cultivate and reproduce them.